Hey guys, today I'll show you a science fiction thriller TV series named Warehouse 13, Season 1, Part 1. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The drama begins with FBI agent Myka carrying out a mission at the National Museum of Natural History in Washington. The details of the mission will be revealed later. The scene shifts to another agent, Pete, who has just had a 2-minute one-night stand with a young woman and is already preparing for round 2. Inside the museum, a staff member is working on an artifact, a strange head. He isn't sure what it is, but while handling it, he accidentally drops his tool into the mouth of the object and reaches in to retrieve it. At that moment, Myka and the museum director suddenly call out to him, and the staff member is startled. He explains that the statue is called the Aztec Bloodstone, an ancient artifact used in sacrificial rituals, possibly related to virgin sacrifices. He plans to clean it for an evening exhibition. After the two leave, the staff member resumes retrieving the tool, but his hand is accidentally cut by the bloodstone's sharp crystal teeth. He doesn't seem to be concerned about the injury. The scene shifts again to Pete gathering his things and preparing to carry out the mission, extremely exhausted after his hormone yoga session with the one-night girl. On the table, there's a special invitation from the president saying he was invited to attend the opening ceremony of the World Ancient Artifacts exhibition hosted by the president. It looks like the mission involves protecting the president. At the evening party, a waiter walks around with champagne, and the girl from Pete's one-night fling is among the guests. Suddenly, the museum staff member appears, grabs a glass, and drinks it in one go, immediately breaking into a cold sweat. He looks over at the Aztec Bloodstone, seemingly about to do something drastic. Myka and Pete are colleagues, both involved in the same mission. They each want to be in charge, and there's a clear rivalry between them with frequent arguments. As they're talking bullshit, the president arrives. Myka instructs the staff to let him through, but Pete hesitates, sensing something is wrong. Myka insists on letting the president pass. Meanwhile, the staff member stands motionless in front of the bloodstone, diabetic blood dripping from his fingers. Something is clearly off. Suddenly, an elderly man appears, takes out an electromagnetic gun, and knocks an agent unconscious before heading for the elevator. Inside the exhibition hall, Pete suddenly notices that the bloodstone is bleeding. He tries to alert others, but no one listens, so he decides to move the artifact himself. At this point, the one-night fling girl shows up and asks him what he's doing there. Pete replies he's working, not doing hormone exercise. She asks if there is a fire. Pete, caught in a lie, hastily says he's a firefighter. Realizing his cover is blown, Pete quickly grabs the bloodstone and heads out, calling his team to warn them that the bloodstone is dangerous and needs to be moved. Myka also realizes something is wrong with the museum staff, noticing the blood trail on the floor. Suddenly, the staff member pulls out a knife and starts attacking people. Myka moves quickly, warning the president to stay back while subduing the staff member. Pete trips and drops the bloodstone, which lands on the floor. The elderly man, who has taken the elevator up, steps on it. Wearing purple gloves, he starts handling the bloodstone in a strange way. Meanwhile, the museum staff member manages to overpower Myka using his muscles, but Myka turns the tables, knocking him to the ground. Suddenly, the bloodstone flashes with golden light, and as the light fades, the staff member collapses unconscious. When Pete comes to his senses, both the elderly man and the bloodstone have disappeared, and the bloodstains on the floor have mysteriously vanished. After a while, Pete's superior, Daniel, finds him and says he had reported some bizarre things, like a stone bleeding and flashing with golden light. Now the higher-ups are questioning whether he was on drugs during his mission, so he was suspended and under investigation. Pete is not happy about this. He asks what about the museum staff member, the guy with the knife, but no one knows, because that man is still unconscious. In stark contrast, Myka is being praised by the president for subduing the staff member, and she's about to take a seat with the VIPs. Pete, however, is off to the bathroom to provide a urine sample. When Pete gets home, he's surprised to find a woman in his house whose name is Irene. She introduces herself, saying she is with the government, and she's here to recruit him. Pete is completely confused. Irene continues, explaining that they'll be heading to South Dakota the next day. By noon, they need to arrive at a specific set of coordinates, and the meeting is to remain confidential. The job will be indefinite. Pete refuses, saying he's not going anywhere. But the next day, he finds himself on the road, following the GPS to some desolate land. After a long drive, they finally reach their destination, a run-down, dilapidated warehouse that's clearly been standing for ages. Yep, this is warehouse number 13. After knocking a few times, Pete hears a whistling sound. Turning around, he's suddenly hit by a football. Confused, he wonders who has such a strong arm. After a while, Myka arrives in a car. They compare notes and realize they were both sent here by Irene. Suddenly, the door opens. As they prepare to enter, someone appears behind them. It's the elderly man who stole the bloodstone that night. His name is Artie. Holding a newly repaired fishing rod, he introduces himself as Dr. Artie from Special Operations, and he's working for Mrs. Irene. Pete, irritated, asks if he was the one who threw the football at him. Artie admits it, saying Pete was still at home when he threw it. It had to make a big loop before it came back to Pete. Artie invites them inside and throws the football out again. After walking down a hallway, they reach the entrance to the warehouse, which looks like an old office. Beyond it is the full view of warehouse number 13. Artie tells Myka the warehouse is understaffed, so they two are a perfect team. Pete is quick-thinking with sharp intuition, and Myka is observant and meticulous. Before Myka can respond, she tosses her bag and heads off to make a phone call, leaving Pete to continue listening to Artie's briefing. Artie pulls out a photo of Irene surrounded by agents. They are the former colleagues of Artie's. Myka calls her superior, Daniel, hoping to get transferred back. But when she asks about the details, Daniel has no idea. He only knows that Mrs. Irene issued the transfer orders. Daniel advises Myka to stay and follow through for now, as Irene's authority far surpasses his own, but promises to try and get her sexy body transferred back. Artie reappears and asks why she is standing in cow dung while making a call. Myka looks down to find a huge pile of cow manure at her feet. The only cow in sight means the warehouse has probably been around for centuries. Artie drives them around in a golf cart, giving them a tour. He explains that the first warehouse, number 13, was built in 1898. Over time, the interior has been constantly renovated and expanded until it reached its current state. It's filled with all kinds of strange items, what they call collections. Artie tells Myka to put her hand on a railing, explaining that it's a conductive pipe that channels the magnetic fields away from them. Otherwise, the electrical fields generated by their bodies could cause a disturbance in the items here. Pete and Myka are both confused, asking Artie to stop joking around since there's no such thing in the world. Artie explained that there's also a helicopter here, one that was pulled from the Bermuda Triangle. The Bermuda Triangle has been trying to bring it back ever since. Suddenly, a static charge crackled towards the three of them. Artie told them not to worry because this happened often with the artifacts since they generate static electricity. Pete thought it was pretty cool, but Myka considered them both idiots. Artie continued, saying, "These artifacts generate tangential energy. Tangential energy is the kind of energy that can affect people, and it's the primary source of power for these artifacts. That's why Warehouse 13 exists, to keep these artifacts safe and prevent them from causing harm." Suddenly, Pete found a water bottle in his hand. He hadn't even noticed how he picked it up. Artie said, "That's the mysterious tangential energy at work." What he's holding is a wishing bottle. He tells Pete not to make a wish, but just hold on to it for now and wait for him. Myka urged Pete to open it, and when he did, it was empty. At that moment, Artie rolled over a barrel of purple liquid, asking Pete to place the bottle inside. The purple liquid was a neutralizer, capable of canceling out the tangential energy. Myka was skeptical and grabbed the bottle herself. Suddenly, a ferret crawled out from the bottle. Artie quickly put the bottle into the neutralizer, and there was a faint crackling sound, followed by a slight vibration. A wallet fell out from the shelf and into Myka's bag. Artie turned to Myka, asking if she was trying to transfer positions. Myka was taken aback. Artie said, "It would never happen, because if she wishes for the impossible, the bottle will give her a ferret instead." With that, their tasks became clear. Find the artifacts, neutralize them, transport them to the warehouse, and label them. Their temporary accommodations were in a small town not far away. Upon arrival, a female employee of the warehouse named Lena greeted them. Pete couldn't take his eyes off her because her sexy body was stunning his brain. Lena seemed to sense Pete's thoughts, giving him a strange look before walking away. Back in her room, Myka noticed the wallet had fallen out of her bag. The description inside indicates its owner is a famous magician who is capable of communicating with the dead. Myka pulled out a photograph of the magician, and as she stared at it, the man in the picture suddenly appeared behind her and called her name. When she turned around, though, no one was there. Meanwhile, back at the warehouse, Artie was busy operating some equipment, pinpointing a location where there was unusual activity. It seemed like he could detect the presence of artifacts through his computer. Using the surveillance cameras, he tracked a man and pulled up his profile, showing it to Pete and Myka. The man's name was Cody, a law school graduate from a university in South Iowa. His parents had died in a plane crash, and he had used government aid to complete his studies. He seemed like a good kid, but it turned out he had beaten his girlfriend and was now in custody. Artie suspected this unusual behavior was somehow connected to an artifact, so he prepared a list of questions for them to ask Cody. He also brought out a steel barrel filled with the neutralizing liquid. If they found an artifact, they could place it in the barrel, or if it didn't fit, they could pour the neutralizer directly on it. Artie also handed them a video call device invented by Farnsworth in 1929, the same person who invented the television. Lastly, Artie showed them a Tesla gun created by Nikola Tesla, the same electromagnetic gun he had used at the museum. This gun had another function. It could erase short-term memories. Once they were ready, Artie instructed them to head to South Iowa. After they left, Lena quietly took the musician's wallet from Myka's room, holding it with a pair of tongs. Artie glanced at it, alarmed, and quickly grabbed a bag to place the wallet inside. This bag was likely coated with the neutralizing agent, blocking the electromagnetic fields, but some of the energy had already been absorbed by Myka. The two of them drove all the way to Iowa and were just about to meet with Cody when Myka received a call from Daniel. Daniel told her that he had looked into the background of Irene and that she had worked for the Treasury Department in the 1950s. Myka thought something's not right. If Irene worked in the 1950s, she should be long gone by now. So she told her superior that the person he's looking into must not be the same one she was meeting. Daniel insisted that Myka hold on for another 48 hours. He would continue investigating and promised to bring her back. Myka and Pete arrived at the detention center to see Cody. They pulled out the list of questions Artie had prepared for them. These questions were likely side effects caused by the artifacts. Not only Cody, but Pete and Myka couldn't help but feel frustrated. What kind of ridiculous questions were these? Cody said he couldn't remember ever hitting his girlfriend. He woke up and found himself in the detention center. Suddenly, Cody seemed to go into a daze, and both Myka and Pete sensed something was wrong. A cold breeze began to stir around them. Cody was mumbling something, but it wasn't English, and they couldn't understand it. Pete quickly pulled Myka into a corner, and they watched as Cody overturned the table in front of him. The table almost landed on Myka. As they were leaving, a blonde woman stopped them, saying she was Cody's lawyer. She was close with Cody's parents and had always treated Cody like her own son, essentially acting as his godmother. The lawyer sharply told them to leave and warned them not to investigate Cody any further. Once outside, Myka asked Pete how he knew she was going to flip the table. Pete shrugged and said it was just a gut feeling, much like how he had sensed something bad was going to happen at the museum. Just then, Artie contacted them through Farnsworth's device. He told them that the detention center had sound surveillance, and he was trying to decode what Cody had been mumbling. All they knew was that it was Italian, but it was too unclear to make out the exact words. Luckily, there was a university nearby, Cody's school, so the two of them decided to seek help. They found a professor and played Cody's mumblings for him. After listening, the professor said, "It's ancient Italian." The amazing part was that the professor could understand it. He quickly translated, "If people understand my fear, they will understand my pain." The professor mentioned that his specialty was studying the Renaissance, but he hadn't been to Italy in 2 years. Pete asked if he knew Cody. The professor replied he had read about him in the newspapers, but he didn't really know him personally. Once they were outside, Myka remarked the professor definitely knew something since his neck veins were bulging. Pete was surprised by her observation. Myka continued, saying the professor arranges his books alphabetically. One pen holder holds pens, another holds pencils. But after using the pen, he put it in the pencil holder. Pete then commented that the professor was nervous. Sure enough, the professor retrieved an object from behind a book on the shelf. The first page of the object contained the exact same phrase from ancient Italian. The professor immediately picked up the phone and made a call. Meanwhile, Myka called an old colleague to investigate the professor's background. On the other end of the professor's call, he was speaking to someone. He said the police came to see him, but he didn't tell them everything. It's about that object, and her boyfriend quoted that line from it. The person on the other end of the line was Cody's girlfriend. Pete filled Artie in on the situation, describing Cody's manic behavior at the detention center. He mentioned how he felt a wave of heat hit him when Cody went wild. Artie responded that he would look into the records. After hanging up, he suddenly had a thought. Meanwhile, Myka's colleague had found out more about the professor. The professor was passionate about Italian art and had just returned from Italy 8 weeks ago. Before Myka could react, she heard someone call her name, and in a startled panic, she dropped the phone. Once outside, Myka told Pete what had happened. Pete, a little skeptical, asked if she was sure she didn't just imagine that and if it could be post-traumatic stress. He said he heard about what happened in Denver. Myka saved a lot of people there. Myka interrupted him, saying a lot of people died too. Suddenly, something clicked in Myka's mind. The professor had lied. He had said he hadn't been to Italy in 2 years, but he had just returned 8 weeks ago. The two decided they needed to investigate Cody's girlfriend. Meanwhile, the professor was in a discussion with a woman. He said he really shouldn't have brought it back from Italy. He would return it to Rome next week. Just then, the woman flicked on a lighter, holding something shiny and golden in her other hand, which captivated the professor. In the warehouse, Artie was following a map, searching for an artifact. He slid right into the location and found a painting. Pete and Myka located Cody's girlfriend, who had just started her shift. She explained that she was very close with the professor and mentioned she had a performance coming up, with the professor as their academic advisor. The two of them confirmed the professor's earlier lie. He hadn't mentioned Cody's girlfriend at all before. It turned out that the professor and Cody's girlfriend had known each other for a long time. Cody had never hit her, only that one time, and when he did, he was speaking in Italian. Cody's ability to attend college was thanks to the help of his godmother. When they asked who his godmother was, Cody's girlfriend revealed that it was none other than Cody's lawyer. Pete repeated the phrase, "If people understand my fear, they will understand my pain," and asked if the girl had heard it before. The girl appeared very uneasy, claiming she hadn't, and quickly left. The scene cut to the professor, who seemed dazed and out of sorts, walking into a gas station. He placed his keys on the pump, doused himself in gasoline, and set himself on fire. On the road, Pete noticed an ambulance rushing past and immediately followed it. When they arrived, they found the professor had been reduced to a charred corpse. The gas station attendant said that when the professor set himself on fire, he was mumbling strange Italian phrases. Pete spotted the professor's keys on the pump and quietly took them, deciding they needed to investigate the professor's office next. The scene shifted again. Daniel was still in his office looking into Irene, preparing to make a phone call when Irene herself showed up, accompanied by a bodyguard. Daniel was taken aback, asking how they got in here. Irene replied they just walked in. Daniel asked if Warehouse 13 was hers. Irene smirked and admitted that the warehouse is hers, and so are Myka and Pete. She then warned Daniel not to get them back. On the way, Myka hesitated as if she wanted to ask something, but Pete cut in, asking if she wanted to know about his intuition, like how he knew something had happened to the professor when he saw the ambulance. He explained his dad was a firefighter. One morning when he was 12, he had a feeling that he would never see his father again. Later that night, his father saved 2 kids at a fire but was killed in the process. That's when he started having this sense of intuition. In the professor's office, Myka noticed something off with the serial number of a book, so she pulled it out. Pete gestured for her to keep searching, and soon enough, Myka found a small object hidden inside. Pete carefully opened it, only to find it empty, except for a space in the middle, as if something had been placed there. Just then, the door swung open, and Cody's lawyer and godmother walked. She said the professor didn't commit suicide. Someone broke his heart and forced him into it. It turned out that the lawyer and the professor had been in a relationship for 3 years before breaking up because the professor had fallen in love with someone else. The woman who made the professor change his heart was Cody's girlfriend, meaning that Cody's girlfriend had an affair with the professor, which might explain why Cody had hit her. The 3 of them decided to investigate Cody's girlfriend. The lawyer said she and Cody were at the theater. They should go now. Also, Cody's girlfriend has withdrawn the charges against Cody. With that, the trio set off to speak with Cody's girlfriend. In the warehouse, Artie finally managed to carry the painting to the entrance, exhausted. Not only was he overweight, but it seemed his legs were also in poor shape. On the way to the theater, Pete seemed to have figured something out. He opened the small object again and looked at the lawyer, noticing that she was wearing a hairpin. The shape of the hairpin perfectly matched the empty space in the object. Pete motioned for Myka to pull over, but suddenly the lawyer grabbed the steering wheel. Myka panicked and slammed on the brakes. The car spun to the right and flipped twice, coming to a dramatic stop. Myka opened her eyes to find herself in a hospital bed, with her superior standing by her side. Daniel said someone was here to see her, and that person would help her get back to where she belongs. A little while later, someone took Myka's hand. Looking up, she saw a man with blonde hair. He told her she shouldn't be here. Myka replied neither should he. The blonde man told her to keep moving and urged her to get up. As he spoke, a trail of blood dripped from his forehead. Suddenly, Myka woke up. Everything had been a wet dream. She rushed to the car to pull Pete out. The lawyer had already disappeared. Pete said the culprit was the lawyer, and the hairpin she was wearing must be the artifact. At that moment, Artie also shared his discovery. He explained that the hairpin once belonged to Borgia, a notorious woman who ruled Italy in the 17th century along with her father. The hairpin had been crafted by an alchemist, and it likely contained a type of mind-altering agent that was fused into the coating process. It would affect the brain's chemical reactions. The Italian phrases the lawyer had spoken seemed to be some sort of linguistic command. In the end, this woman, Borgia, was full of resentment, having suffered through tormenting love throughout her life. It was likely that the professor had brought back the jewelry box from Italy and given it to the lawyer. The small object was actually the jewelry box. The lingering resentment from Borgia attached itself to the lawyer, causing her to crave and resent love. This led her to manipulate Cody into attacking his girlfriend, driving a wedge between the two of them. The lawyer saw Cody as her own son and harbored deep hatred for his cheating girlfriend. Borgia had ruled with bloody tyranny 600 years ago, and now this hairpin symbolized her return. If not stopped, the lawyer might just unify the country under her rule. The three of them rushed to the theater, where the performance had just ended, and everyone was celebrating its success. Cody and his girlfriend were in a passionate tongue massage. The lawyer walked to the center of the stage, holding the hairpin, and pointed it toward the crowd, making a sweeping motion. As she did, she spoke the same Italian phrase. Pete decided to take the direct approach, while Myka would flank from the side. Pete pushed through the crowd, watching as Cody lifted his girlfriend up like a chicken, preparing to set her on fire. Myka appeared from the side, aiming her gun at the lawyer. The lawyer asked if Myka really let her lover die. It turned out that the blonde man Myka had seen earlier was her boyfriend, who was supposed to have died in the Denver operation. As she spoke, the lawyer grabbed a hairpin and aimed it at Myka. Myka, in turn, pulled out a balled gun, ready to take her own life. Pete, unable to do anything else, used his Tesla gun to knock her out. Cody grabbed Pete's gun and aimed it at him, while everyone chanted the Italian phrase. Unfortunately, the Tesla gun had run out of power, but fortunately, Pete's gun was unloaded. Myka regained consciousness, grabbed something, and knocked the lawyer out. Pete snatched the hairpin and threw it to Myka, who tossed it into the neutralizer. A flash of golden light filled the air as the energy was sucked into the steel barrel. Everyone's minds cleared and they regained control. After the situation was resolved, the jewelry box and hairpin became permanent exhibits in Warehouse 13, where they would remain in eternal slumber. Daniel called Myka once again, explaining the new deal. She could return to Washington, but only if she came alone. Pete would have to stay behind. If she refused, she would continue working in the warehouse. She had 5 seconds to decide. Daniel counted down, and after 5 seconds of silence, Myka didn't respond. It seemed she had already made her choice to stay in the warehouse. The scene shifts to a Chicago bank where a group of armed robbers stormed in. The leader dramatically opened his coat and music began to play. Suddenly, the surveillance system went dark with a loud click and a wave of light burst from inside. It looked like this was going to be the case they'd have to deal with. The scene shifted to Warehouse 13, where Pete was playing ping pong with the magic mirror. Artie was scanning the bank robbery from his computer, but something was off. The screen kept flickering. After muttering a curse at the computer, he threatened to sell it if it didn't work. Sure enough, it started functioning again. But then, the screen started flashing random characters. Artie realized it wasn't the computer that was malfunctioning. It was someone attacking the firewall. Not one to back down, Artie started tracking the attacker. The screen went black for a moment before returning to normal. Realizing they'd been traced, the attacker disconnected. Artie was amazed by his technique and determined to track this person down. Pete finished his game and stepped out, only to have his watch alarm go off. It was time to catch the football. He asked Myka what she was doing, and just as she answered, the football hit her square in the chest. Artie stepped out and told them both they needed to investigate the bank robbery in Chicago. This was the third one in the city. The two quickly headed to the scene, hoping to access the surveillance footage. Just then, a tall, leggy woman walked in. Pete froze and started gulping. The woman was a federal agent from Chicago, also investigating the bank robbery. They exchanged looks, and the woman didn't hesitate to expose their past, saying they, too, nearly killed the president and got exiled, and now they were meddling in her investigation. Pete barely heard her, his eyes glued to her long legs. Myka explained they're here to help. The woman shot back, saying she didn't need their help and turned to walk away. Pete, still distracted, sighed and said he's falling in love. While working on the case, Myka kept calling her mom, and it seemed like she had a falling out with her dad and was reluctant to visit him. Myka, an only child, mentioned that her dad owns a bookstore called Myka and Sons, which was indeed a weird name for a bookstore. Hearing this, Pete said it's none of his business, but if his dad were still around, he would definitely go see him. In the warehouse, Artie was hard at work trying to find the hacker who had compromised his computer. Determined, he was on the brink of discovery. Pete reached out to the leggy agent again, hoping to extract some intel. They learned that all 3 banks had been robbed during peak hours on a Friday. Pete checked his watch. It was Friday, and there were only 6 hours left until rush hour. 2 suspects were already identified, and they seemed to use some kind of control mechanism to make people willingly hand over money. The banks essentially delivered the cash themselves, and none of the witnesses could remember what had happened. Myka forwarded the bank surveillance footage to Artie. In the footage, a man with a shaved head could be seen holding his phone throughout the incident. Myka theorized that whoever was on the other end of the call must have heard something important. Even though there were no eyewitnesses, they had an ear witness, so Pete and Myka began their investigation. It turned out that the bald man had been leaving a voicemail at the time, and the voicemail captured some bald sounds at the scene, including a piece of music. When they listened to it, it was just bald music, nothing else. The leggy agent brought over one of the bank staff to assist with the investigation. Pete jokingly asked if Pete's charm worked its magic on her since she didn't want them involved. When Myka played the voicemail and the music started, the bank employee's pupils suddenly dilated and tears of joy streamed down his face. He said the music made him feel loved. Once the music stopped, he returned to normal. The employee explained that the music had an emotional effect on him. Myka wondered why the music didn't have the same effect on her or Pete. Artie explained that the effect only worked when experienced live, and sensory memory allowed the emotions to resurface when the music was played back. Pete remarked that the melody sounded a lot like his dad's favorite song. Artie looked it up and found that it was composed by an artist. As Artie continued his investigation, Pete revealed that his dad was a huge fan of the artist and had even taken him to one of the artist's concerts as a child. Artie cross-referenced the melody with the artist's style and confirmed it was indeed one of his compositions. They decided to investigate the artist. At the same time, Artie finally tracked down the hacker. Turns out, it was Myka and Pete's former superior, Daniel. Artie decided to travel to Washington to confront Daniel in person. Meanwhile, Myka and Pete located the artist's home. His housekeeper was shocked to hear about his connection to the bank robberies and couldn't believe it. She explained that the artist had bipolar disorder and was recently diagnosed with liver cancer, with only about a year left to live. Myka tried to talk to the artist, but it was clear that his mind wasn't entirely lucid. Pete noticed a photo of a young girl on a piano. It was the artist's daughter. When asked where she was, the housekeeper replied that she didn't know, saying that she had left her father behind. Pete sat at the piano and began to play the same melody the bank robbers had used. Myka was surprised by his skill. The artist, visibly moved by the music, teared up and tried to say something. After struggling for a while, he finally said he wanted a sesame pancake. The housekeeper explained that the artist used to live in his studio, where he would compose and perform music, rarely doing anything else. The artist added that he was searching for a key that could touch the hearts of people. One day, the artist's work was stolen. Not stolen in the traditional sense, but rather through fraud. A record company owner tricked the artist into giving away the rights to his music. Since then, the artist seemed like a different person. Pete and Myka decided to find the company owner and question him. On the way, Pete explained why he could play the piano. It turned out his piano teacher was incredibly attractive to him. Myka mentioned that there was a family gathering next week, but she wasn't looking forward to it because her father was always too harsh on her, leaving her with a lasting sense of dread. The two arrived at the man's record company. Pete couldn't help but flirt with the receptionist, who was also quite attractive. Meanwhile, Pete noticed that one of the large offices was completely empty, and Myka observed that the magazines on the desk were from 3 months ago, an indication that the company was close to bankruptcy. Just then, the company owner appeared. He flatly denied stealing the artist's music rights, claiming instead that he had acquired them legally. The artist's music had fallen out of favor and hadn't been in demand for a long time. However, the record company owner mentioned that someone had recently offered to buy the artist's work anonymously. The music shelf was also full of dusty cassette tapes. The man explained that these were experimental pieces the artist had created at the suggestion of his sound engineer. The sound engineer had encouraged the artist to explore new sounds that people might crave, but the result was garbage, noise that sounded like a brick being tossed into a washing machine. All of the artist's work was stored here, and only the artist had the key. No one else could get in. At that moment, the receptionist came over and said there was a phone call for the company owner. The man left the room, and Myka and Pete decided to find the sound engineer, the artist's sound engineer. Late at night, the receptionist was seen talking to a man, revealing that the special task force had started investigating. The man turned out to be one of the culprits behind the bank robberies. He had two accomplices, a male partner and the artist's housekeeper. The housekeeper remarked that the money wasn't enough and that they seemed to be planning another robbery. The scene shifted, showing Myka and Pete finding the sound engineer's records. 6 months ago, he had worked as a cab driver but had since gone missing. As it turned out, the sound engineer was the receptionist's accomplice and also the getaway driver. Meanwhile, Daniel left his office, giving Artie the chance to sneak in and start hacking into his computer. On the other side, Myka was still pondering the case when she was startled by the sound of a waiter dropping a plate. This seemingly minor noise gave her a sudden epiphany. At the same time, Artie managed to crack the computer password and was preparing to access the system when Myka contacted him to share her discovery. She explained that sound reflects off tiles and becomes amplified, which is why singing in the shower often sounds better. She realized that all the banks that had been robbed shared one common feature. They were all decorated with tile or marble. The reflective and resonant qualities of these materials contributed to the manipulation of people's emotions. While discussing the case, Daniel returned. Artie, unfazed, pulled out a camera and took a picture of Daniel, who instantly turned into a photograph. This was an artifact known as the Kodak Instant Camera. After investigating, they found that two banks shared the same interior design style, and one of these two must be the target of the criminals. Meanwhile, Pete continued talking to the leggy agent, who told him a story about Myka. It was rumored that during the Denver operation, Myka's boyfriend had died. However, he was a married man, albeit separated. At that moment, Artie shared Myka's discovery with Pete, and the two quickly regrouped, deciding to investigate both banks one by one. Coincidentally, just as Myka arrived at one of the banks, she spotted the criminals carrying suitcases, preparing to escape. Though she gave it her all, she managed to apprehend only one of the culprits, allowing the other two to flee. The one she caught was none other than the sound engineer. Myka remarked that one of the others was definitely a woman. Pete joked, asking how she knew it and if she grabbed her smelly parts. Myka smacked the flirt and said that's because she smelled perfume. In Daniel's office, Artie took another photo of him and Daniel reverted back to normal. Artie demanded to know what Daniel wanted from him since he had been hacking his computer all this time. But Daniel denied it, saying he didn't have time to hack him. At the police station, Pete told Myka to put on her earplugs immediately, sensing danger. Sure enough, someone walked in wearing a black coat, and underneath was a music player. Everyone except Myka was entranced, lost in boundless happiness. Another criminal quickly rescued the sound engineer. Realizing she couldn't stop them, Myka discreetly slipped her phone into the sound engineer's pocket. The scene shifted to Daniel, who began explaining hacking techniques to Artie. The hacker mirrored 12 proxy servers, one of which is his computer, so it looks like the attack came from him, but it wasn't. Artie was stunned to hear that. Daniel reassured him the fact that he got this far is impressive. Apart from them, no one else in this building would even notice. Just then, Myka contacted Artie, asking him to track her phone. Meanwhile, Pete was becoming unreliable, having fallen under the influence of the music and started flirting with the leggy agent. Artie borrowed Daniel's computer, jokingly telling him not to worry since he won't look at classified stuff. Meanwhile, Pete grabbed Myka's hand and suddenly had a revelation. He reasoned that her hand smells like the receptionist's perfume. So, the receptionist is one of the criminals. Myka realized the criminal had indeed grabbed her hand earlier. Artie tracked the location of Myka's phone and informed the two of them. It turned out to be the artist's home. They immediately rushed over. The housekeeper, upon seeing them, said they weren't doing this for the money. At that moment, piano music could be heard upstairs. When they went up, they found the artist playing the piano. It turned out the receptionist was the artist's daughter. The bank robberies were all to buy back the artist's music, hoping it would restore his sanity. The record company owner's so-called anonymous buyer was the receptionist herself. Pete and Myka decided to only take the music records and not pursue charges against the three for the robberies, leaving that decision to the leggy agent. Watching the touching family reunion, Myka was moved and called her father. Back in Daniel's office, Artie continued trying to locate the hacker. After connecting the wires, mysterious images flashed in his mind. It's a short-haired girl and a boy. Who exactly was hacking the Warehouse 13 system remained unknown. The scene shifts to Pete and Myka on a mission at the Paris Museum. Their target is an artifact tied to history, the blade of Marie Antoinette's guillotine. Marie Antoinette, often referred to as the epitome of grace and elegance, was executed during the French Revolution. Pete takes the lead in stealing the blade while Myka creates a diversion, attracting all the attention. After a grueling ordeal, they manage to snag the blade, barely. Pete narrowly avoids getting decapitated, and Myka is almost captured. The artifact's exact power remains a mystery, shrouded in speculation. Back at the warehouse, Artie continues investigating clues about artifacts. Strange events are reported in a remote fishing village in Colorado. A cheerful nun climbs onto a roof, stretches out her arms, and leaps off. A boy snaps the bow of his violin before smashing the entire instrument to pieces. An elderly woman smashes a family urn against a hospital wall and spray paints an illegible word over it. Artie relays the incidents through the intercom, but Pete and Myka, having worked together for a while now, remain locked in a battle of egos, constantly bickering. They've been at it since Paris. Artie warns them repeatedly to rein in their emotions, as negative energy could destabilize the artifacts. But the warnings fall on deaf ears, and the two keep squabbling. Seeing the artifacts on the verge of a meltdown, Artie decisively intervenes, dousing them both with the neutralizer. Pete suggests to Artie that one of them has to take the lead. He should be the leader, and Myka just needs to follow his orders. Artie, in an attempt to maintain peace, replies he had got natural leadership qualities, but he needs to make Myka believe she's the leader. It'll make things easier for all of them. Pete agrees, saying he will humor her. Despite their animosity, the mission must go on. Artie hands them a dossier on the fishing village and throws in a set of oddball questions. Lacking his own car, Pete decides to borrow Artie's vehicle. Artie reluctantly agrees, but lays down strict rules. No speeding over 55 miles, no eating in the car, and no parking near anything suspicious. It's clear the car is Artie's pride and joy. As Pete leaves to grab the keys, Myka corners Artie, saying one of them needs to take charge. She should be the leader, and Pete will follow her orders. Artie, amused by the déjà vu, repeats that she has natural leadership qualities, but makes sure Pete thinks he's in charge. Myka agrees and leaves, satisfied. Artie chuckles to himself, keeping both of them happy is turning into a full-time job. Just then, the warehouse employee Lena walks in, asking about the hacker situation. Artie assures her that nothing can breach the warehouse firewall, not even the most sophisticated hackers. Pete and Myka promptly arrive at the fishing village to investigate the bizarre incidents. The first thing they see is the elderly woman from earlier kicking over a trash bin and pulling out an old newspaper. Sensing something off, they decide to follow her. The woman engages in conversation with a delivery driver who, preoccupied, brushes her off. In response, she slams his head onto the counter, shattering the glass. Realizing what she's done, the woman appears remorseful, but she can't seem to figure out why she acted that way. Pete asked the police if there was any connection between the nun, the boy, and the elderly woman. The officer, unimpressed, asked who he was. Pete didn't reveal his identity as a special agent, instead claiming he was on his honeymoon with his wife. Suddenly, the police received new information. A schoolboy, the same one who smashed the violin, had just been stopped while attempting to set his classroom on fire. The officer left to investigate, and Myka snapped at Pete, challenging him for why he lied about them being on their honeymoon and why he just couldn't keep his mouth shut for once. She stormed off, leaving Pete behind. The two decided to split up, with Myka going after the nun and Pete investigating the schoolboy. At the church, Myka learned from the nun that she believed she could fly. After a brief conversation with the priest, Myka entered the room where the nun had been staying, only to find her gone. The window was wide open. The nun had climbed to the roof and, thinking no one was watching, spread her arms and leapt off. Unsurprisingly, she didn't fly. She fell, leaving herself severely injured and paralyzed from the waist down. Meanwhile, Pete met up with the police again, this time flashing his special agent badge. But just as he was gathering more information about the schoolboy, the boy suddenly fell into a coma. Pete reported everything to Artie back at the warehouse. While Pete and Myka were dealing with their investigation, Artie noticed something odd. Parts of the warehouse's electrical system started glitching, with lights flickering on and off. He quickly resolved the issue, only for it to immediately happen again. Something was clearly wrong with the circuitry. Myka later reported back to Pete, saying the nun, the schoolboy, and the elderly woman are completely unrelated. They don't know each other. Just then, the elderly woman's doctor arrived. Myka had called him in, hoping to learn more. Pete, ever the joker, said he would leave them two to talk and reminded her not to forget to use protection before walking away. The doctor explained he can't stay long. His wife's at home taking care of their twins. He added that the elderly woman's husband had died of a heart attack in the very hospital where she smashed the urn. He speculated that unresolved medical disputes could have triggered her behavior. But then, mid-conversation, the doctor suddenly tilted his head, his expression shifting into a sleazy leer as his eyes fixated on Myka's chest. The doctor snapped out of it, apologizing profusely. Moments later, however, he reached out and grabbed her hairy chest. His hand wouldn't stop moving, as if he had lost all control. Myka twisted his fingers to subdue him, realizing that whatever was affecting the nun, the schoolboy, and the elderly woman had now taken hold of the doctor as well. With time to kill, Pete attended a local group therapy session. While listening to a heavy-set man recount his struggles, the man suddenly tilted his head and left the room in a trance. Sensing something was off, Pete followed him. Meanwhile, Myka restrained the doctor by locking him to a metal pipe to prevent him from causing further trouble. When questioned, the doctor admitted he had treated the elderly woman before but denied knowing the schoolboy and said he'd only seen the nun briefly at the church. Back at the therapy session, the heavy-set man raised a glass to drink, despite claiming to have been sober for 20 years. It seemed the affliction was bringing out people's deepest desires. In the man's case, it was alcohol. For the doctor, it was touching people inappropriately. One of the therapists present revealed that he had previously treated both the heavy-set man and the doctor. Before he could say more, the man in fat collapsed, falling into a state similar to the schoolboy's. Meanwhile, Artie was still working on the warehouse's electrical system. Frustrated by the overly complex circuitry, he muttered, "Who designed this junk?" Lena chimed in, saying it's Thomas Edison, Nikola Tesla, and Escher, all legends of their fields. She explained that Edison and Tesla, despite being friends and rivals, were pioneers in electronics and had even jointly won a Nobel Prize, which they both refused to accept because they didn't want to share the honor with each other. She added that Escher was a master artist known for his intricate, perspective-defying works. His style even inspired the architecture in movies like Inception and Harry Potter. But before Artie could retort, the warehouse's entire electrical system suddenly went dark. It seemed the circuitry was beyond repair. Pete decided to visit the therapist's home to investigate further. The therapist, however, refused to provide any details, citing patient confidentiality. Frustrated, Pete declared he would find out for himself. He proceeded to confiscate everything in the house that seemed remotely like an artifact, determined to get to the bottom of the mystery. Myka went to see the priest to ask if the nun had ever received therapy from the psychologist. The priest said she hadn't. Although he had suggested it, the nun had refused. The elderly lady hadn't received any psychological treatment either. Since her husband passed away, she'd lost faith in everything. Suddenly, Myka said that made sense. Ever since her boyfriend died, she had lost faith too. She had even started to resent men. Daniel, Pete, her dad, they're suffocating her. She was clearly losing it. The priest had to call out to her several times to snap her back to reality. When Pete caught up with Myka, he exclaimed the case was closed and proudly displayed the artifacts he'd collected. Myka responded by punching him square in the face. Pete was bewildered. She punched him again and even struck a police officer nearby. Realizing she was affected by whatever was causing the strange behavior, Pete quickly caught on. Myka pleaded with Pete to lock her sexy body up. Otherwise, she might lose control and hurt him badly. Pete replied she was the team leader. If he locked her up, who's going to call the shots? Artie called them and told Pete the items he found weren't the right artifacts. The real one is still out there somewhere. Back at the warehouse, Artie realized that the electrical issues were due to a hacker who had started attacking the warehouse's firewall. Lena asked if they should do something. Artie assured her that this firewall is top-notch. No one can break through it. As they continued, Myka looked for any opportunity to take a swing at Pete. They retraced their steps, thinking about what Myka had come into contact with since arriving, places she'd been that Pete hadn't. Pete noticed townspeople heading to the church for a gathering. The elderly lady, the nun, the schoolboy, the doctor, and the man in fat were all church members. A realization struck Pete. He asked if she had been to the church. Myka said she had been there twice. Pete said he hadn't and deduced that the artifact was in the church. They returned to the priest to confirm that all these people had interacted with him, suggesting the artifact was somewhere in that building. Interestingly, the priest himself wasn't affected. The three of them searched around and finally found the culprit, the sofa right in front of them. The priest explained this sofa belonged to his ancestor. He had placed it in the church just a week ago. Myka and Pete relayed this to Artie. A quick online search revealed that this ancestor was a master of hypnosis. Artie realized why people were acting hypnotized. He told the priest to dismantle the sofa. Maybe the springs were magnetized or the screws were causing it. Years of hypnosis and brainwave influences might have activated it. Anyone who sits on it has their deepest desires amplified. Suddenly, they heard commotion outside. They rushed out to find the town sheriff shooting the priest in the arm. It turned out the sheriff had also sat on the sofa the day before. His deep-seated desire to improve the town had twisted into a plan for a massive cleansing. He was now strapped with several sticks of dynamite. Myka shouted for Pete to douse the sofa with neutralizer, while Peter countered he would handle the sheriff. They started arguing, and Myka punched Pete right on the nose. Left with no choice, Pete rushed to deal with the sofa. He poured the neutralizing agent over it, but the sheriff only hesitated briefly before becoming even more agitated and activating the timer on his explosives. Thinking fast, Pete grabbed a fire axe and decided to destroy the sofa physically. Meanwhile, Myka wrestled with the sheriff. In the nick of time, Pete swung the axe, smashing the springs inside the sofa. The artifact's influence vanished, and the sheriff returned to his senses. Pete quickly defused the bombs and carried them outside. A loud boom followed. Myka thought Pete might not have made it and was momentarily relieved, but then Pete walked back in unharmed. After returning to the warehouse, Pete expressed heartfelt thanks to Artie for lending them his car. After learning that he had used the car to dispose of the bomb, Artie's face fell as if he might cry. Both Pete and Myka burst into laughter and revealed they were joking, and that's what he got for sweet-talking both of them. Shortly after, another series of sparks and explosions erupted. The warehouse's electrical system had completely collapsed, and the word "knock" flashed on the screen. It was clear that the warehouse's firewall had been breached by the hacker. Frustrated by the relentless cyber attacks, Artie dozed off at his desk. In his wet dream, he found himself lying naked on the floor. Irene appeared and told him to get up and he had been here before. But Artie couldn't move. Suddenly, someone sprinted past him. Artie woke up abruptly, only to find himself handcuffed. Standing before him was a short-haired girl, the same one he had accidentally seen on Daniel's office monitor. The alarms had been dismantled, and Artie realized that he knew the girl. Her name was Claudia. It turned out that she was the one who had been hacking into the warehouse's systems all along. The handcuffs she used on Artie were her own invention, 20,000-volt shock cuffs. Artie also understood why she was there. Her brother, Joshua, had died in an incident related to Artie's work. Claudia was likely seeking revenge. She coldly said it's time for him to make things right for what he did to her and her brother. As she spoke, she pushed Artie forward and out of the room. Meanwhile, Myka and Pete returned from their mission, only to find the warehouse door ajar and no one inside. Alarms had been deactivated. Both of them drew their guns and stepped cautiously inside. Confused by the situation, Irene called and briefed them on the news. She instructed them to use a continuous spectrum analyzer to search for any traces of what had happened. She explained that the spectrum analyzer was a device resembling a camera that could record residual images from the last 5 hours. Claudia brought Artie to a lab. Artie recognized it as Joshua's old workspace. Artie protested, saying her brother died in an accident and it had nothing to do with him. But Claudia countered, correcting him that her brother isn't dead. He's just trapped, and Artie has to help her get him back. Back at the warehouse, Myka and Pete located what seemed to be a camera-like device. When they turned it on, 2 figures appeared on the screen. Adjusting the settings, they found footage of a girl leading Artie away. Pete, surprisingly adept at lip reading, deduced the girl's name was Claudia. He explained that his sister had taught him to read lips, and he quickly pulled up Claudia's profile from the warehouse's archives. She was currently listed as living in a residential care facility. Wasting no time, the two arrived at the care facility. The manager informed them that Claudia had lived there for 4 years and had never caused trouble. She had been orphaned at a young age and raised by her brother, who had later died in an accident. Records showed that Claudia had moved out 2 months ago, with no known destination or friends. Searching her old room, Pete and Myka discovered walls plastered with documents, photographs, and clippings, all centered on her and her brother. In the lab, Claudia looked pale and exhausted, as though drained. She and Artie were discussing a mathematician named Redicus. Claudia explained that Joshua had been attempting to verify one of Redicus's theories when the tragic incident occurred. She insisted once again that her brother is not dead, he would see soon enough. Suddenly, Artie felt a moment of disorientation and found himself back in the scene where he first met Joshua and Claudia. Joshua had been demonstrating his experiment to Artie, hoping for approval to proceed with his research. The vision quickly faded, and Artie returned to the present. Claudia remarked that she experienced the same thing, constantly revisiting the past. Artie realized that these flashbacks were somehow tied to Joshua's lingering presence. As the lights flickered, Claudia seemed to tremble, as if her soul was about to leave her body. A ghostly figure appeared, rushed past them, and dissipated. It was unmistakably Joshua. Claudia had not been lying because Joshua's spirit was still present. For years, Claudia had been trying to recreate Joshua's experiment, not only to honor his memory, but also to give him peace. However, the unintended consequence was that his spirit remained tethered to this realm. What exactly was Joshua's experiment? The details remained unclear. While searching Claudia's room, Artie and Claudia found that Joshua had been deeply engrossed in studying Redicus. Some books were even missing from the shelves, likely taken for the research. Artie tried to dissuade Claudia, warning her that the experiment was not only complex, but also highly dangerous. Claudia's response was firm. He could help her, or she would do it on her own. Claudia revealed that she had spent 2 years chasing this goal, but all roads had led her here, to a state of despair. While accessing Warehouse 13's system, she had stumbled upon data that suggested Artie's research might hold the key to saving her brother. To her frustration, she also discovered that in the past 12 years, Artie had never made any attempt to rescue Joshua, which left her both shocked and furious. Artie tried to explain he thought her brother was dead like a piece of shit. Claudia's nose began bleeding as she grew more agitated. Artie pointed out this experiment was taking a toll on her. Redicus's work was focused on spiritual transmission. If she continued, it would cost her life. And even then, Joshua might never come back. Despite his warnings, Claudia refused to give up. Back in Claudia's room, they uncovered a significant clue. Many diagrams showed a specific device, something resembling an instrument. Myka suddenly remembered an old legend about Redicus's compass, a unique artifact that had never been found. Its purpose was a mystery, but its absence was well known. In the lab, Artie asked Claudia what she was using to substitute for the compass. It seemed this compass was critical to the experiment. Claudia suggested they use a similar metal. Artie shook his head, saying she can't simply replace an artifact. This compass must have unique properties. Claudia begged Artie to think of a way to save her brother. Moved by her determination, Artie hesitated, unsure of what to do. Suddenly, Pete received an anonymous call. It was Artie who told him not to worry about him, before abruptly hanging up. Myka and Pete, frustrated and confused, returned to the warehouse, debating why Artie refused to let them help. That's when Irene showed up, saying she had been trying to contact the warehouse but got no response, so she came in person. Upon hearing about Artie's involvement with Claudia, Irene suggested she might know where he was. She instructed Pete to retrieve an item from the warehouse, explaining that every artifact is an extension of its owner's will. To understand Redicus's compass, they needed to first understand the man himself. Irene also tasked them with uncovering what went wrong with Joshua's experiment 12 years ago. Without revealing Artie's location, she left abruptly. Following Irene's instructions, Pete and Myka found a large chest containing various objects once used by Redicus. Most of it appeared to be junk, but among the items was a ring engraved with the letter T. Myka found this odd, as Redicus's name starts with an R. Pete suggested this indicated that he didn't follow rules or conventions. Inside the chest, they also found an object drawn on Claudia's wall. Pete pried off the sphere on top of the object, discovering hidden text beneath it. Meanwhile, Artie retrieved an artifact from his car, a lightning rod that Benjamin Franklin had carried as an emergency travel tool. Artie had decided to help Claudia rescue her brother. Regardless of where Joshua was trapped, it was likely in an unstable alternate dimension. The lightning rod's ability to anchor individuals to normal spatial dimensions was critical to Artie's plan. After some clever work, he quickly built an experimental setup. However, Claudia began to weaken, and Artie felt dizzy, slipping into his memories. He found himself back 12 years ago, when Joshua had told him about his plans for an experiment. Artie had tried to dissuade him, warning of the risks, but Joshua revealed a compass belonging to Redicus. He believed it was the key to success, though its origin remained a mystery. Returning to reality, Claudia collapsed after a nosebleed. Moments later, Joshua's spirit appeared, urging Artie to abandon the attempt since they didn't have enough energy. Claudia had repeatedly tried the experiment and, while unsuccessful, had created a connection to the alternate dimension. Joshua warned that each time he appeared, her life was drained. Another attempt could kill her. They must destroy this link using the lightning rod. Artie hesitated, knowing this would also cost Joshua's existence. However, Joshua pleaded with him to save his sister, and he had already accepted his fate. Pete and Myka shared their findings with Irene. Redicus had a history of defying rules, and Claudia's notes indicated that Joshua's old experimental equipment remained in its original location. Artie would likely attempt the rescue there. The two quickly set off to find him. At the lab, Artie reflected on Joshua's experiment. It was a form of mental transmission, essentially controlling thoughts, a complex and dangerous procedure. Artie remembered trying to dissuade Joshua, asking for the compass to keep it safe. Joshua agreed, promising to return shortly, but after a long wait, he didn't come back. Artie and Claudia went to find him, only to discover Joshua mid-experiment. The experiment failed, and Joshua vanished. This revealed the compass's true ability, to transport individuals to another dimension. Back in the present, Artie ignored Joshua's warning and increased the lightning rod's energy, determined to fulfill his long-ago promise. Pete and Myka arrived in time to share their discoveries with Artie. They explained that Redicus had loved mysteries and had hidden mechanisms in his instruments. It was likely the compass contained something crucial. However, the compass had been transported with Joshua into the alternate dimension. As Joshua's spirit reappeared, Artie took his hand, promising to bring him back. Suddenly, Artie and Claudia were pulled into the alternate dimension, where Joshua greeted them with a quarrel. Artie stopped their argument and told him to hand over the compass. Joshua gave him the compass, and Artie carefully examined it, finding a combination lock with letters. Claudia suggested they try Thomas because Redicus had written a poem about losing his lover, Thomas, which symbolized his emotional turmoil. The code worked. Inside was a Latin inscription instructing them to rotate the compass needle 90 degrees. The plan worked. Joshua was freed from the alternate dimension, though Claudia, strangely, appeared older, while Joshua remained as he had been 12 years ago. Back at the warehouse, Irene commented that she did the right thing, but she also didn't. She likened it to her own past when she could have saved someone but chose not to. Now Claudia knew about the warehouse and what she had to do. Irene walked off without elaborating. The scene shifts to the past when a member of the Lenape tribe went into a cave and retrieved several items. He donned the feathered cloak and offered a prayer to the heavens to give him godlike powers. Fast forward to the present, someone wearing that same feathered cloak broke into a high-end auction house in New York City, walking through walls into a secured room, stealing a valuable piece of art, and then escaping the same way. The theft quickly caught Artie's attention. The stolen piece was a sculpture by the obscure sculptor. As Artie discussed the case, they overheard loud arguing. It was none other than Joshua and Claudia, who had been rescued previously. Claudia wanted to kick Joshua out because all he'd been doing since his return was watching videos online. Joshua defended himself, saying after being stuck in a parallel dimension for 12 years, of course he needed to catch up on current events. Artie assigned Claudia a task: write a report detailing how she hacked into the warehouse's firewall. Artie said she did it well, he would spare her punishment, and might also offer her a job here. He instructed her to repair the warehouse's systems and wiring afterward, then assigned Pete and Myka to investigate the theft. The crime was bizarre. The auction house had state-of-the-art alarms, walls 8 inches thick, and yet the statue had vanished in an instant. The two arrived at the auction house in New York. Their host was a long-legged beauty. Pete, clearly captivated, couldn't take his eyes off her long leg. The stolen statue had been consigned by a real estate mogul who had only shown it to 2 potential buyers, both prominent figures. As the assistant entered the room's password, Myka speculated that the theft might be an inside job, orchestrated to inflate the statue's value. Pete, distracted, suggested the assistant herself might be worth investigating. Myka couldn't stand Pete's antics any longer and pulled him aside, telling him to investigate those 2 buyers while she handled the scene here. That way, maybe he would even get to ask the leggy beauty to the movies. Excited by the prospect, Pete went to a construction site and met one of the buyers named Lippin. Lippin was aware of the theft, but claimed if he wanted it, he would just buy it. Stealing is for peasants. Pete felt like a fool, since Lippin's logic was solid. Pete asked, "What's the appeal of this statue since it looks ridiculous?" Lippin shrugged, saying in a rich man's eyes, "Beauty is subjective." Pete realized the conversation was going nowhere. He noticed a surveyor staring at him with a strange bracelet on his wrist. Just then, Myka called, saying she detected a scent of gummy bears. Pete rushed back to find Myka pulling a feather out of a wall with her purple-gloved hand. Pete took the feather and felt his entire arm become weightless. Ecstatic, he began rubbing the wall, then moved on to rubbing nearby crates, saying this is the artifact he had always wanted. He could use this to waltz into any bathhouse he wanted. Myka grabbed it back and told him to return it immediately. She pinched Pete's arm and he felt pain, proving the feather's effect was limited to his arm. This suggested the artifact was incomplete. Pete and Myka showed the feather to Artie, who immediately recognized it as something originating from Native American culture. Pete added that the other one of the buyers was ridiculously rich, and he didn't think they needed to bother asking him. He's probably not a thief. However, Artie told the two they should still investigate the tycoon buyer since the rich were easy to be a scammer. The pair headed to the tycoon's house where they immediately spotted the missing statue on display. Pete was thrilled, saying that this is the easiest case he had ever solved. But before they could act, the tycoon appeared and explained, "That's not the missing statue. This piece is part of a 4-statue series, each named after one of the 4 elements. The one they see here represents fire. The one stolen from the auction house represents wind." Pete asked how he could tell them apart. The tycoon smugly replied that they needed a sharp eye, capable of discerning details. Pete stared at the statue but found nothing until he noticed a label reading "Fire" at the base. Annoyed, Pete muttered, "That's rich people and their arrogance." The tycoon continued to explain the 4 elements, earth, wind, fire, and water, and said the series was a tribute by the sculptor to Native American myths about creation. When Pete asked if he had lost a feather and if he used it to phase through walls and steal things, the tycoon's expression turned nervous, and he immediately called over a long-haired individual. Pete recognized him. It was the same surveyor he had seen earlier at the construction site. Without hesitation, Pete drew his gun and pointed it at the man, saying since he was both Lipin's employee and the tycoon's worker, there's no way he was innocent. The tycoon quickly interjected, saying, "He's harmless, but if someone's phasing through walls, that would mean none of his statues were safe." Pete, showing his badge, reassured him no need to worry since they would move them to a secure location. Back at the warehouse, Lena was about to move a chess piece when Artie stopped her, saying this game had been sitting here for 3 months. He's playing against himself, waiting for a moment of brilliance to save the white pieces. Meanwhile, Claudia was exhausted from repairing the warehouse's firewall. Walking by, she casually picked up a white piece and made a move, instantly checkmating black. While Myka and Pete were transporting the statue, they stopped at a red light. Suddenly, someone wearing the feathered cloak phased through the wall of the truck and attacked Pete. His head was covered, obscuring his vision, and he couldn't see who it was. Myka glanced in the rearview mirror and saw that Pete was halfway out of the truck. She ordered the driver to brake hard, flinging Pete onto the road. The surveyor got out to check on the situation, but the mysterious figure simply stole the truck and drove off with the statue. Stunned, the two wondered, with an artifact like this, why would he go through all this trouble for a statue rather than rob banks or vaults? Meanwhile, Joshua was preparing to leave Claudia for a while, as Artie had recommended him for a position at a European nuclear research center. The siblings hugged each other goodbye, reluctant to part. Back at the warehouse, Artie and Lena investigated the feathered cloak, quickly uncovering its connection to the Lenape people, who believed the world was created by the souls of the 4 elements. Artie wondered aloud if these artifacts really control those 4 elements. If so, the consequences could be catastrophic. Artie shared his findings with Pete, asking him to investigate the tycoon further. At that moment, the tycoon was dining with Myka, explaining that while he inherited his father's fortune, he intended to use the money to undo the damage his father had caused. Myka was unsure whether the tycoon was truly a good person or simply putting on a facade. Meanwhile, Artie discovered that the tycoon's father had been competing with Lipin over ownership of the statues. Both men wanted the complete set of 4, believing that bringing them together would trigger something significant. At the tycoon's home, Pete stumbled upon a conspicuous mechanism. Activating it revealed a hidden room filled with items belonging to the sculptor of the 4 statues. Pete immediately called Myka to report the discovery and mentioned that the tycoon appeared to be collecting the sculptor's artifacts. While investigating the documents in the room, Pete learned that the sculptor had married a Lenape woman who likely knew the secrets of her people. It seemed the 4 statues served as keys to a sacred cave. According to legend, the cave contained 4 offerings meant for the creator, the same 4 items described earlier. Collecting all 4 statues would reveal the cave's location. Elsewhere, Lipin's bodyguard caught the surveyor loitering suspiciously nearby and brought him in. Lipin examined the bracelet the surveyor wore, which was inscribed with strange symbols representing the 4 elements. The surveyor explained that the bracelet had belonged to his sculptor uncle, making the surveyor a descendant of the Lenape people. Lipin, who had known this all along, had hired him for that very reason. Lipin then donned the feathered cloak, revealing himself as the true thief. Glancing at the text on the bracelet, Lipin read the words, "The truth will be revealed at dawn." Seizing the surveyor, Lipin demanded an explanation, pressing his muscles against a wall. When the surveyor admitted he didn't understand its meaning, Lipin ruthlessly sealed him inside the wall. Meanwhile, Myka and the tycoon returned home. The tycoon told Myka they had to stop Lipin. He's about to find the sacred cave, and some things aren't meant to be in the world. At dawn, Lipin's research bore fruit. A beam of sunlight struck one of the statues, illuminating a shadow that marked the sacred cave's location. Realizing the importance of his discovery, Lipin rearranged the 4 statues into a straight line, aligning the sunlight perfectly. He then destroyed the ruby embedded in the statue, ensuring no one else could ever learn the cave's location. Back at the warehouse, Claudia packed a bag, preparing to leave for Las Vegas. Artie, however, was too absorbed in his map research to notice her departure. Frustrated, Claudia commented that the Lenape are an ancient people. Modern maps are useless for this. Realizing she was right, Artie joined her in examining ancient maps. They found that an additional river existed in the past, which would have affected the cave's location. Combining this with the knowledge that the cave was underground, they deduced it must be somewhere far from major drainage systems and subway lines. Artie pinpointed the location and shared it with Pete and Myka. When he turned around, Claudia was already gone. The tycoon, hearing the location, noted that it was one of Lipin's construction sites. He said Lipin had been digging under the guise of studying the sculptor's work, but clearly he was after something much bigger. The group rushed to the location of the mysterious cave. By the time they arrived, Lipin was already overseeing his workers as they drilled toward their target. After a precise explosion, the entrance to the cave was almost visible. A worker suggested continuing with the drill, but Lipin stopped him, telling him to guard the entrance before donning the feathered cloak and phasing through the earthen wall. The workers were stunned before one of them ran away in fright. Inside the cave, Lipin drank from the water of eternity, which granted him everlasting life and energy. Feeling rejuvenated, he then seized the floating arrow, the arrow of nature, which gave him control over natural forces. Meanwhile, Pete, Myka, and the tycoon arrived at the construction site. Learning about the cave's location from the fleeing worker, they hurried inside to stop Lipin. Inside, Lipin unknowingly opened another section of the cave using the arrow of nature. The trio followed the opening and found Lipin holding a stone that transformed his arm into solid rock. It was the sacred stone, which bestowed immense strength capable of defeating hundreds. The tycoon pleaded with Lipin to stop, warning him that he didn't understand the forces he was playing with. Lipin ignored his bullshit and used the arrow to unleash a gust of wind, pinning Myka and Pete to the wall. He then grabbed the obsidian orb, gaining control over fire. At a critical moment, Pete managed to wrestle the arrow of nature from Lipin. Seizing the opportunity, Pete drove the arrow into Lipin's chest. Lipin disintegrated into a beam of light, shot up into the sky, and vanished, leaving only his clothes behind. Myka commented that she thought the 4 elements were supposed to be incredibly powerful, but it turned out they were not all that. Back at the warehouse, Claudia returned from Las Vegas, boasting about the massive sum of money she had won gambling. Artie said she should stop goofing off at her age and instead go to college or something. Claudia replied that college was boring, life here was much more exciting. Artie, unconvinced, asked if she was really ready. Meanwhile, Myka and Pete were assigned a new mission and headed to St. Louis to investigate a bizarre natural gas explosion. Outside the police station, Pete noticed an enormous generator parked nearby, a clue for later. Inside, they learned that the explosion had claimed 6 lives. The police chief described the incident. A gas main had ruptured and caught fire the previous night, triggering the explosion. The remaining engineers were still examining the site. The chief wished them luck and left. While it seemed like a routine accident, the victims' bodies were completely charred, not as if they'd been burned by gas or fire, but rather by intense electrical currents or flames of an unusual origin. Pete and Myka carried lanterns as they attempted to investigate the walls for the source of the explosion. Pete's intuition flared again, saying something else must have happened here. Myka discovered a hidden doorway that had been sealed with cement but was blasted open by the explosion. They entered and found a corner of the space containing a skeleton. Upon closer inspection, they realized the person hadn't died recently. The remains were very old. Inside the clothing, they found a wallet containing a special agent badge identical to theirs. Pete also discovered a Tesla gun on the skeleton, confirming the individual's identity. He's a former agent working for the warehouse. Alarmed, the two reported their findings to Artie, who instructed them to send the body back for examination. When told it could take days, Artie asked Myka to send photos in the meantime so he could investigate the agent's identity and mission. Pete speculated that the agent had carried an artifact, and the explosion had reawakened it, leading to the burns and fatalities in the area. He concluded that this artifact must be extremely dangerous. After the call, Artie headed to the archives to investigate the missing agent's identity. By then, Myka had sent over photos, but they were too blurry for Artie to analyze. Claudia smirked at what they had obtained and began to show them what she had made. She unveiled a modified device, an upgraded version of a Bow-Way spectral analyzer, explaining this wasn't just a boring spectral scanner anymore. She turned it into a full holographic projector. With a few adjustments, Claudia transformed the photos into clear holograms, revealing a tattoo on the skeleton's left hand. At the police station, Myka reported that 7 individuals had gone missing, but only 6 bodies had been found. The 7th missing man was unaccounted for. She speculated the man might be a witness or the one carrying the artifact. Cut to the 7th missing man, who was seen running through an alley with 2 friends. Panicked, he shouted that someone was after them. Moments later, lightning bolts flashed, accompanied by crackling sounds. In an instant, the man and his friends were reduced to charred corpses. When the police arrived, they confirmed that these deaths had nothing to do with the natural gas explosion. Among the bodies, they found the missing man, who had strange fabric on his back. Upon removing it, they discovered a mysterious handprint burned into the fabric. They wondered if this could be some kind of mystical palm strike. Back at the warehouse, Claudia's efforts had fully restored the tattoo, which turned out to depict an eagle perched on a globe with an anchor, emblems of the Marine Corps. Artie noted that, historically, only a handful of warehouse agents had ever come from the Marines. The new information from Myka and Pete also arrived. After some analysis, Artie wondered if this could be the Babylon battery. It was unearthed in 1952, then stolen, but it wasn't in Missouri. It was last reported in Texas. Or if it could be a microfission device. The handprint on the man's back clearly wasn't his own. Artie thought maybe someone else at the station was carrying the artifact. This didn't seem random, and there could be a connection between the victims. Pete and Myka's investigation revealed that all 6 victims were from the same gang. It turned out that the 6 who died at the police station had been arrested during a gang brawl. They attempted to access gang-related files, but discovered that an anti-gang officer who handled gang investigations was on vacation. To their surprise, the mysterious figure in a photo was none other than the anti-gang officer himself. Determined to question him, Pete and Myka prepared to follow this new lead. Meanwhile, the body of the former agent arrived at the warehouse, where Artie and Claudia used her holographic projector to scan it again, yielding much clearer results this time. Artie reviewed photos of all Marine Corps warehouse agents and quickly identified the man as Jack, who joined the Marines in 1948 and became a warehouse agent in 1955. The last known location for Jack was Minneapolis, far from St. Louis. Artie entered the code 5485 on a keypad, and a hidden room appeared before him. It's Jack's personal quarters. According to warehouse protocol, if an agent is declared missing or deceased, their quarters and personal items are sealed and stored in a special area of Warehouse 13, preserving them exactly as they were. Artie and Lena inspected the room. The drawers were filled with cigarettes, suggesting Jack was a heavy smoker. They also found a piece of paper saying he would be staying in a small town for a few days. Artie examined it closely and noted the handwriting appeared to belong to a woman, as it carried a faint perfume scent. It seemed like a note left by a woman Jack was in contact with, possibly someone he cared for. Searching further, Artie discovered stationery that revealed the name Rebecca when lightly shaded with a pencil, along with an address in St. Louis, the very location Pete and Myka were investigating. The duo decided to visit Rebecca, who turned out to be an elderly woman and, perhaps, Jack's girlfriend at the time. When Pete informed Rebecca of Jack's body being found in the basement, she appeared emotional. Pete asked if she remembered Jack mentioning anything unusual before his disappearance. Rebecca hesitated and asked if this was related to the recent electrocution deaths at the police station. Pete and Myka, citing the confidential nature of the investigation, did not share details. At that moment, Myka received a call. There had been another electrocution death. They prepared to leave quickly, but Rebecca asked if there was another electrocution. Myka refused to share any details before they left. At the scene of the latest incident, the police had apprehended a boy who accused an officer, identified only by the number 501, of committing the murder. The chief dismissed the claim, saying no police officer would do such a thing, and he was just trying to protect his gang members. Still, Pete and Myka decided to investigate 501, who turned out to be the anti-gang officer currently on leave. When Pete and Myka arrived at the officer's home, they saw electromagnetic sparks on the doorknob and faint blue and white light glowing underneath the door. Upon entering, they found the officer attempting to escape through the window, a metallic scorpion-like device emitting blue sparks attached to his back. He jumped from the 5th floor unharmed. The two gave chase but eventually found the anti-gang officer dead in an alley with the device gone. Pete and Myka reported this to Artie, who examined Jack's body further and discovered puncture marks on his spine. Artie concluded that the device must have latched onto Jack's spinal cord and emitted electromagnetic currents that could burn victims to death. It sounds parasitic. Myka had an epiphany, saying Rebecca must know something. She specifically asked if people were being electrocuted. How could she know that when they hadn't even discovered it yet? Why didn't she think it was fire instead? The duo returned to Rebecca's home, where she greeted them at the door. Rebecca already knew they were from Warehouse 13. She told them before Jack disappeared, he was investigating this artifact. It's called the Spine of Saracen, and now it's back. Pete and Myka were stunned. They realized Rebecca wasn't just an ordinary civilian, she was a former warehouse agent herself. Rebecca confessed that she wanted to tell them this last time, but they didn't give her the chance. Rebecca retrieved her old research notes and explained that the first recorded appearance of the Spine of Saracen dates back to an 11th century exhibition. She had initially planned to give up investigating the artifact and settle down with her boyfriend Jack for a stable life. But Jack had a strong feeling that their mission wasn't over yet. Soon after, Jack disappeared. Unable to find him, Rebecca changed her name and identity, going into hiding in St. Louis, hoping that one day she would discover what had happened to Jack. She showed them a drawing of the Spine of Saracen with the words "Hand of God" written in Jack's handwriting in one corner. At that moment, their Farnsworth buzzed. Rebecca glanced at it and laughed, saying after all these years, they were still using this old thing. It seemed that they never heard of smartphones. On the line, Artie shared his findings. Saracen was a Turkish people, and during the First Crusade, there was a legend of an invincible army that was undefeated in battle. Their soldiers were seemingly unstoppable, their combat abilities enhanced, likely due to the parasitic spine's effects. This matched Rebecca's account of the 11th century exhibition, which Artie deduced was likely a display meant to promote the artifact as a weapon of war. Artie also uncovered an ominous warning. The Spine of Saracen requires a lifelong commitment, and if it isn't contained, more people will die. Pete and Myka returned to the site of the anti-gang officer's death, where they heard a scream. They turned to see a man who had been parasitized by the Spine of Saracen. Using Tesla guns, they managed to dislodge the spine, but the host died in the process. It became clear that once the host dies, the parasite abandons them and searches for a new host. Suddenly, the parasitic spine shot out of the grass. Pete shoved Myka out of the way, but it latched onto him instead. Myka tried to intervene, only to be electrocuted and knocked unconscious. When she woke up, Pete was gone. Artie explained this spine was like a soldier manufacturing machine. It treated the human body as a battery, boosting its power while reconfiguring the host's electrical impulses. In simpler terms, it cranks up adrenaline, testosterone, and other hormones until the body's energy is completely drained. Then the parasite goes dormant, waiting for a new host. Now Pete was essentially discharging electricity all over the place. He was in grave danger. Rebecca suddenly arrived. Seeing Myka's distress, she said she lost Jack, so she couldn't let her lose her partner. They need to save him. Myka realized that the parasite heightened its host's anger and compelled them to seek revenge on those they despised most, just as the anti-gang officer had hunted gang members and the previous host had pursued his ex-wife. She reasoned that Jack must have locked himself in the basement to prevent harming others, and Pete was likely thinking the same thing. Claudia had a sudden idea, saying that the "Hand of God" words Jack wrote on that drawing indicate the lightning. So if they could use high-voltage electricity, they might be able to fry the parasite's nerve endings and force it off the host. Since Tesla guns had failed to kill the parasite, they would need a much stronger power source. Just then, the police chief arrived, saying Pete had been spotted at the station. Myka immediately realized there was a generator at the station, and Pete must have figured out that the hand of God refers to high-voltage electricity. She rushed to the station. When Myka arrived, Pete was shouting that the spine demanded a lifelong commitment and they couldn't save him. While he was still in control, they needed to leave. There was one problem. Pete couldn't reach the parasite on his back. Desperate, he begged Myka to electrocute him. Naturally, she refused. Rebecca stepped forward and said she would do it. With a pair of pliers in hand, she clamped onto the spine and activated the power. A flash of sparks and lightning coursed through the room, dislodging the spine from Pete's back. Limping, the parasite tried to escape but was promptly crushed by Rebecca. Myka performed CPR on Pete, who eventually gasped and came to life with a yell. After the incident, Rebecca traveled to Warehouse 13, personally handing the crippled spine of Saracen over to Artie. She took the opportunity to revisit the warehouse, noting that it hadn't changed at all. It still trapped everything here. Before leaving, she visited Jack's old quarters, which remained exactly as they were when he disappeared. Artie handed her a ring he'd found in the drawer, engraved with the heartwarming words. Rebecca chuckled bitterly, remarking how life had a way of messing with fate. Myka tried to reassure her, saying maybe Jack's ultimate choice was her, not the warehouse. As Myka prepared to leave, Rebecca grabbed her arm, telling her to leave this place while she was still young, because Warehouse 13 doesn't just trap artifacts, it traps people too. It'll consume her until there's nothing left. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.